The cameras flashed. The crowd held its breath. Jonathan Roumie, the man millions know as Jesus from The Chosen, stepped forward with a humble smile and extended his hand. Across from him stood the most powerful religious figure on earth, Pope Leo XIII. The meeting had been anticipated for months. Headlines teased it. Believers prayed for it, even skeptics tuned in. Everyone expected a warm embrace between two symbols of faith. But then, something no one saw coming happened. The Pope looked at Jonathan's hand and didn't move. He folded his hands behind his back and refused to shake it. Gasps rippled through the room. Whispers erupted among reporters. Cameras zoomed in. The air turned heavy, as if time itself froze inside those marble walls. Jonathan's smile faltered for a second, just a flicker, but his eyes stayed calm. He slowly lowered his hand, bowed his head slightly, and whispered something no one could hear. The Pope's guards tensed. His advisors looked confused. Was this a rejection? A message? Or some kind of test? A few feet away, a journalist muttered, "Did the Pope just refuse him?" Another whispered, "Maybe he disapproves of the show." The tension thickened like fog, but Jonathan didn't step back. He simply stood there, still respectful, unshaken, as if he knew something no one else did. And in that silence, something powerful began to shift, because what looked like rejection was about to become revelation. The Pope slowly raised his eyes to meet Jonathan's, and for a brief moment there was no audience, no cameras, no titles. Just two men of faith, standing face to face. What the Pope did next left even his closest advisors speechless, and when the truth came out about why he refused that handshake, it turned the whole room into tears. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, if someone publicly embarrassed you like this, would you walk away? Or stay calm and trust there's a bigger reason? Because what happens next will make you rethink what respect truly means. The Vatican courtyard shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Bells tolled softly in the distance, echoing through stone corridors that had witnessed centuries of faith, power, and human frailty. It was a day meant to celebrate unity, the meeting of two figures who, in very different ways, carried the image of Christ before the world. Jonathan Roumie, calm but visibly humbled, followed the procession of aides through the ancient hallways of the Apostolic Palace. He wasn't there as a celebrity, nor as a man basking in fame. He came as a believer, one man of faith hoping to meet another. For weeks his team had prepared for this encounter. News outlets called it the meeting of the century, a bridge between faith and film, art and spirituality. Thousands waited outside St. Peter's Square, holding posters from The Chosen, singing hymns and praying for a moment of grace. Inside, however, not everyone shared the excitement. Behind polished doors and gilded walls, whispers circled among cardinals and attendants. An actor portraying the Son of God. Is that not a form of pride? He's just another Hollywood face chasing holiness. Does he come for blessing? Or recognition? But Jonathan didn't hear their doubts, or maybe he did and chose not to listen. Because he wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to give thanks for being allowed to play the role that changed his life and touched millions of hearts. When the great double doors opened, the air turned sacredly still. At the far end of the hall sat Pope Leo XIV, dressed not in ceremonial robes but in a simple white cassock, a man of faith who believed humility was stronger than any crown. Yet behind his eyes there was something else, something unreadable. Jonathan approached slowly. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each step measured, each breath steady. The cameras rolled, the flashes glowed, and the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. He smiled, extended his hand, and said softly, "Your Holiness." "It's an honor." For a heartbeat, it looked like the Pope would respond. But then, silence. The Pope's gaze moved from Jonathan's hand to his face, and without saying a word, he placed both his hands behind his back. The crowd murmured. Photographers froze mid-click. Even the air seemed to gasp. Jonathan's extended hand hung there unshaken. His expression didn't harden, it softened. He lowered his arm gently as if to protect the sacredness of the moment and bowed his head. "Peace be with you," he whispered. The Pope gave no reply. Not yet. A reporter's camera shutter broke the silence. Another whisper followed. "Did he just refuse the handshake?" Why would he do that? What does it mean? It didn't make sense. Pope Leo XIII was known for compassion, for greeting beggars before bishops, for blessing strangers in the street. So why reject the man whose work had drawn millions closer to faith? Jonathan, meanwhile, remained calm. He took a small step back, folded his hands together and smiled. The same quiet, grounded smile the world had come to love. Inside, though, a question stirred. Had he done something wrong? He thought of the years spent portraying Jesus, the prayers before each shoot, the weight of trying to embody kindness, mercy, and truth. He thought of the messages he'd received, people saying they'd found faith again through his work. And now here he was, standing before the Vicar of Christ, being rejected, but instead of resentment, something else filled his heart, compassion. Because even great men can misunderstand. Even holy men can test hearts. Across the hall, the Pope turned slightly as if studying him, measuring not his fame but his spirit. He said something softly to an aide. No one could hear the words. The aide nodded and stepped out of the room. The atmosphere was heavy, but beneath it something divine was brewing, like calm before a revelation. Minutes felt like hours. Cameras lowered. The crowd grew restless. Yet Jonathan stood unmoved, silent, peaceful. It was as if he knew this moment wasn't about recognition. It was about reflection. A Vatican guard, standing by the doorway, later said he saw something in Jonathan's posture. A kind of surrender. Not of pride, but of ego. He didn't demand respect, the guard recalled. He simply radiated it. Then, just as quietly as it began, the meeting was paused. Aides led Jonathan to a side chamber to wait. The Pope remained in the hall, his head slightly bowed. To the world it looked like rejection. But to heaven, it was the beginning of a test that would reveal the true meaning of humility. Because when Pope Leo XIV would finally speak, the truth behind his silence would shake the room and show everyone watching that sometimes a refusal is a revelation in disguise. The news broke within minutes. A single photograph and the Pope turning away as Jonathan Roumie stood with his hand still, outstretched, and flooded the internet like wildfire. Pope rejects Hollywood's Jesus. Roumie humiliated at Vatican. Faith meets ego, and ego wins. Headlines twisted what no one truly understood. Clips from the live stream were cut and shared with outrage. People debated, judged, and mocked. Some defended the Pope. Others defended the actor. Faithful hearts divided overnight. But Jonathan stayed silent. Inside the small chamber where Vatican aides had asked him to wait, he sat by the window, looking out over St. Peter's Square. The cheers from outside had faded into confusion. He could hear the muffled voices of officials through the marble walls, but he didn't strain to listen. Instead, he whispered a quiet prayer. Lord, let me not seek to be understood but to understand. Let me not seek honor but truth. He smiled faintly. He had played Jesus. But today he felt like one of the disciples being tested in faith. Meanwhile, in the grand hall, Pope Leo XIV stood alone before the altar. He removed his zucchetto, the white skull cap, and placed it gently on the marble rail. His eyes closed. His lips moved silently, not in pride but in prayer, because what no one knew was that this moment had been deliberate. Hours before the meeting, the Pope had told his secretary, if the actor has truly learned humility from portraying Christ, he will not need my handshake to prove it. It wasn't rejection, it was revelation, a quiet test of character. For years, the Pope had watched faith become performance, sermons turned into shows, devotion measured by applause. He wanted to know if the man who played Christ could live his teachings when cameras were watching, and when they weren't. And now, watching the stillness with which Jonathan accepted what looked like public humiliation, Leo XIV began to see his answer. Back in the waiting room, Jonathan was joined by a young Vatican assistant, barely 20, nervous, carrying a tray of tea. I just wanted to say, the boy stammered, I'm sorry for what happened, sir. I don't understand why His Holiness did that. Jonathan smiled. Maybe it's not for us to understand right away. But people outside, they're saying terrible things. Jonathan chuckled softly. They said worse things about the one I played. Then he looked at the boy. Sometimes silence speaks louder than defense. The young aide blinked, moved by his calm. Moments later, the Pope entered quietly. No cameras. No entourage. Just the Holy Father and the actor face to face in the stillness of the room. Jonathan immediately stood. "Your Holiness," he said, bowing slightly. The Pope studied him for a long moment. "You didn't leave," he said softly. Jonathan shook his head. "If I left, I might miss what God was trying to teach me." The Pope's eyes glistened. He stepped closer, the tension melting away. "What did you feel," he asked, "when I did not take your hand?" Jonathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Confusion, perhaps, but also peace. Because even in rejection, I sensed grace. The Pope closed his eyes for a moment, deeply moved. "Grace," he repeated quietly. Few people still use that word with truth. Then he turned, looked out the same window Jonathan had been sitting by and said, "Do you know why I refused your handshake?" Jonathan remained silent. The Pope nodded. "Because the world has turned faith into a stage. Everyone wants to appear holy, but few want to be humble. I needed to see if your humility was real." Jonathan lowered his gaze. "And did you find your answer?" The Pope smiled. "Yes." Then, to Jonathan's shock, the Pope slowly dropped to one knee. "Forgive me, my son," he said. "I did not reject you. I was testing whether fame could survive humility. And you have shown me it can." Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes. He reached forward quickly, helping the Pope rise. "Please." "You honor me too much," but the Pope shook his head. "No, Jonathan. You remind me what honor truly means." The door opened, the aides, the guards, the journalists. They all froze. The same man who had refused a handshake now embraced Jonathan tightly, whispering something only the two of them could hear. And in that instant, the misunderstanding dissolved. The cameras captured it, not a scandal but a symbol. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring again. This time not for ceremony, but for grace. Because sometimes the greatest recognition doesn't come from applause or headlines. It comes from being tested and choosing humility over hurt. And though the world thought the Pope had shamed him, the truth was simple. He had revealed him. The world had already made its judgment before the truth ever surfaced. By nightfall, millions had seen the image. Jonathan Roumie's open hand hanging in the air, the Pope turning away. Social media burned with outrage. Hashtags trended worldwide. "The Pope refuses Roumie. Her faith vs fame." Unholy moment commentators debated on every channel. Some said the Pope had disrespected faith in film. Others said Jonathan's fame had made him arrogant enough to expect reverence. And while the world shouted, the man at the center of it all remained silent. Jonathan's team urged him to release a statement. His friends texted him screenshots of angry headlines. But he refused to fight noise with noise. He only said one sentence. "The truth will reveal itself in time. It always does." Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV gathered his senior advisors. He asked for one thing: silence. No press statement. No explanations. No spin. "Let the world see what they wish," he said. "A false story will destroy itself faster than truth can defend it." But deep inside, the Pope's heart was heavy. He had tested a man in public. And while Jonathan had passed that test with grace, millions of believers were now wounded by misunderstanding. That night, the Pope didn't sleep. He prayed. He thought about the faces of those who had lost faith over rumors, those who had stopped believing in goodness because goodness was mocked. And in the quiet of his chamber, he decided, the truth must not only be known, it must be shown. The next morning, when dawn broke over St. Peter's Basilica, thousands had gathered again in the square, not to celebrate but to protest. Some held signs defending Jonathan. Others questioned the church. The tension was thick, the chants loud, and then the massive doors of the Vatican opened, cameras turned, reporters hushed. Pope Leo XIV stepped out onto the balcony, and beside him, to everyone's shock, stood Jonathan Roumie. The crowd went silent. The moment froze, and again, the Pope raised his hand for quiet, his voice calm but powerful. "Yesterday the world saw a picture," he began. "They saw what they thought was rejection, but they did not see the truth." He turned toward Jonathan. "This man stood before me not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a believer. I wanted to see if his faith was performance or conviction. I refused his hand, to see if his heart would remain open." A murmur ran through the crowd. Reporters leaned in. "And what I saw," the Pope continued, his voice trembling slightly, "was not offense, not anger, but humility. the kind of humility the church itself needs to remember. He looked at Jonathan, then back to the sea of faces. Yesterday I tested a man. Today I thank him for reminding me what Christ-like grace looks like in a world that has forgotten silence. The Pope then turned fully to Jonathan, and this time, before the eyes of the world, he extended his hand. The crowd erupted, but Jonathan didn't rush to take it. Instead, he bowed slightly, eyes wet with emotion, and whispered, "Your Holiness, thank you for allowing me to learn from this moment." Then slowly he took the Pope's hand, and the world's cameras captured an image very different from the day before. The handshake that had once been refused was now received, not as a gesture of formality, but as a symbol of forgiveness and faith reborn. The world responds within hours. The narrative flipped. Every outlet replayed the moment live. Handshake of Grace trended globally. Millions who had argued now sat in silence, some in tears. Clips of the Pope's speech flooded social media, this time not with outrage, but with reflection. Comments read, "This is what humility looks like." Jonathan didn't just play Jesus, and he lived his teachings. The Pope taught a lesson the world didn't know it needed. Interviews followed, not the shallow kind, but sincere ones about faith, forgiveness, and what true humility means in an age of spectacle. Even non-believers admitted the power of what they'd witnessed. In churches across the globe, sermons that Sunday began with the same story. A handshake refused, a heart revealed. Behind closed doors later that evening, Jonathan sat once more with the Pope, this time privately. The cameras were gone, the lights dimmed. Pope Leo XIV looked at him with quiet gratitude. "The world saw humility in you, Jonathan," he said, "but what I saw was peace. That peace can't be performed, it's lived." Jonathan smiled. "Maybe peace isn't something we perform, Your Holiness. Maybe it's something we surrender to." The Pope nodded, eyes glistening, and maybe the church needed to be reminded of that. For a long while they sat together in silence. Two men, two callings, one shared lesson. Neither of them spoke again of the refused handshake, because both knew it was never about the handshake. It was about the heart behind it. That day, people stopped seeing a scandal. They started seeing a story of patience, grace, and faith tested in the public eye, because sometimes God's greatest lessons don't come from miracles. They come from misunderstandings that reveal who we truly are. And in that Vatican courtyard, through one simple handshake, the world remembered something it had nearly forgotten, that the purest form of power is humility. That evening, long after the crowds had left St. Peter's Square, a soft rain began to fall over Rome. The marble steps of the Vatican glistened under the glow of lanterns. Inside, the halls were silent, except for the faint echo of footsteps leading toward the private chapel of the Holy Father. Jonathan Roumie followed quietly, still processing everything that had unfolded. The handshake, the crowd's tears, the Pope's words, it all felt like something larger than life, something sacred. At the altar, Pope Leo XIV stood alone, facing a single flickering candle. He turned when Jonathan entered and smiled faintly. "Come," he said softly. "Let us sit." They sat side by side in the front pew, two men surrounded by centuries of art, history, and silence. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the Pope exhaled deeply, as if laying down a heavy weight he had carried for years. "You know, Jonathan," he began quietly, "the first time I saw The Chosen, I was angry." Jonathan blinked in surprise. "Angry?" "Yes," the Pope said, nodding. "Not at you, not at your performance, but at myself. I saw in you something I had lost." He paused, gazing at the candlelight trembling before them. "Many years ago," the Pope continued, "before I wore this white robe, I was a parish priest in Buenos Aires. There was a young actor in my congregation, full of faith, full of fire. He played Christ in a small passion play. One night he came to me and said, 'Father, I don't just want to play Jesus, I want to live like him.'" The Pope's eyes softened, clouded with memory. "I told him to be careful. I said the world doesn't reward humility and it mocks it. But he smiled and said, 'That's exactly why I must live it.'" The room was silent except for the rain tapping against the stained glass. Months later, the Pope continued, he died in a car accident. I never forgot his words. For years I wondered if I had discouraged him. if my caution had dimmed his light. When I saw you play Christ with such conviction, I saw that same fire again, and I asked myself, was it real? Or just another performance? Jonathan sat still, absorbing every word. So when you walked into the hall yesterday, the Pope said, I saw more than an actor. I saw a question from God himself. Do you still believe in the purity of faith, Leo? I needed to know if humility could survive the spotlight. He looked at Jonathan, eyes glistening with sincerity. So I refused your handshake, not to humiliate you, but to test my own heart, to see if I could still recognize holiness when it came in a form the world called Hollywood. The words hung in the air like incense. Jonathan swallowed, overwhelmed. Your Holiness, he said softly, I never expected your hand. I only hoped for your blessing. The Pope smiled, and you gave me one instead. He reached out then, not ceremonially but as a friend, and placed his hand over Jonathan's. You see, my son, he said, God doesn't reveal faith through perfection. He reveals it through pressure, through misunderstanding, through moments that test whether we will respond with anger or grace. Jonathan nodded slowly. So the silence was the test. Yes, the Pope said, because true faith doesn't panic when it's misunderstood. It simply stands still and lets truth speak in its own time. For a while, neither man spoke. The candle flickered, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Then the Pope rose and walked toward the crucifix at the front of the chapel. He touched the wooden cross gently and whispered almost to himself, Every day the world asks us to prove who we are. But Christ never argued. He simply loved. He turned back to Jonathan. And yesterday when you stood silent as the world mocked, you reminded me of him. Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes. He felt small, not in weakness, but in reverence. Your Holiness, he said quietly, if anything good came from me, it's because God allowed it. I only tried to stay out of his way. The Pope smiled, deeply moved. Then you've already learned what most of us spend a lifetime chasing. He looked out the chapel window where the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. The church needed to see humility in action, he said, not in robes or rituals, but in response. And you gave them that. Jonathan stood, unsure what to say. He bowed his head slightly. Thank you for trusting me with the lesson. The Pope shook his head. No, Jonathan. Thank him for using both of us to teach it. They shared a quiet smile, the kind that needs no words. Outside, dawn began to break once more over Rome. The bells of the Vatican chimed softly, echoing through the city. The world would remember the handshake, the apology, the headlines. But for these two men, the true miracle had already happened. Not on camera, but in the quiet corner of a chapel, where pride gave way to peace. And in that stillness, the Pope whispered one final truth. Humility isn't the absence of greatness, Jonathan. It's the presence of grace in the face of it. By the next morning, Rome felt different. The chaos that had filled the streets had faded into calm. The angry debates, the divisive headlines, they seemed small now, swallowed by something bigger. In cafes and churches across the city, people weren't arguing anymore. They were reflecting. Old men over espresso spoke softly about forgiveness. Mothers reminded their children, see, even great men can be misunderstood. And somewhere, someone whispered a truth the world had almost forgotten. Sometimes the loudest voice of faith is silence. The Vatican released only a single statement that day, 6 simple words. Humility speaks louder than any headline, no defense. No excuses, just truth. But what followed was beyond what anyone expected. The ripple clips of the Pope and Jonathan's embrace circled the globe. Not as scandal this time, but as symbol. News anchors who had mocked the snub the day before now spoke with reverence. Churches reopened their doors to full crowds. Atheists tweeted about grace. Celebrities shared the video, writing captions like, "This is what leadership should look like." One post from a teenager in Brazil went viral. Yesterday, I stopped believing in the church. Today I started believing in humanity again. Jonathan saw that comment late one night as he scrolled through his phone in his hotel room. He smiled, tears forming. It reminded him why he had ever said yes to playing Jesus in the first place. Not for fame, not for applause, but for moments like this. The next morning, Jonathan visited a small chapel outside the city. Quietly, no cameras, no attention. He lit a candle and prayed. "Lord," he whispered, Thank you for turning misunderstanding into mercy. He didn't pray for vindication because he didn't need it. The truth had spoken on its own. Inside the Vatican, in his private quarters, Pope Leo XIV sat at his desk, reading a letter that had arrived that morning. It was handwritten, shaky but sincere. He smiled as he read aloud. Your Holiness, I am the mother of the young man you once mentioned, the actor who played Jesus in Buenos Aires. For years I blamed you, thinking you discouraged him. But yesterday, when I saw how you tested Jonathan Roumie, and how both of you responded, I finally understood. You didn't fail my son. You honored his dream. Because through another actor his fire lives on. The Pope closed his eyes, overwhelmed. A single tear rolled down his cheek and fell onto the paper. He whispered, Grace returns when we least deserve it, and most need it. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace, not as a title, not as a pontiff, but as a man. Jonathan's return home. When Jonathan returned to the United States, the world was waiting for an interview, his side of the story. Every outlet wanted the exclusive. But he politely declined all of them. Instead, he released a short video message on social media. Simple background, no lights, no script. Just him. I didn't lose respect that day, he said. I witnessed it, in a form most people wouldn't understand at first. Sometimes God lets the world misunderstand you so he can understand your heart. He smiled softly. I learned something in that moment, that humility isn't weakness. It's strength under control. And if even one person learns to respond to pride with peace, then everything that happened was worth it. He ended the video with a small, almost playful grin. So if you ever reach out a hand and someone doesn't take it, don't pull it back in anger. Keep it open. You never know what God might be doing. The video went viral overnight, not because of drama, but because of truth. The world was starving for it. A legacy of grace weeks later, during the Pope's Sunday address, he mentioned Jonathan again, not by name, but by message. Faith is not proven by miracles, he said from the balcony overlooking the square. It is proven by patience, by the quiet courage to stay kind when the world is cruel, to stay gentle when pride demands noise. He paused, smiled faintly, and added, and sometimes, even a handshake can become a sermon. The crowd erupted into applause, not out of excitement, but out of understanding. Across the world, churches, mosques, and temples alike discussed that moment. Teachers shared it with their students. Parents told it to their children at bedtime. A story about a man who was refused a handshake but never refused grace. It wasn't just a lesson about faith anymore. It had become a story about humanity. Two men, one message. Months later, Jonathan and the Pope would meet again. Privately, quietly, with no cameras, no speeches. They prayed together. They laughed. They shared stories of letters they'd received, from prisoners, from soldiers, from children who said that one handshake had changed how they saw forgiveness. Before leaving, Jonathan asked softly, Do you think the world will remember this, Your Holiness? The Pope smiled, eyes twinkling. If they forget the moment, they will remember the meaning. And as Jonathan walked out of the Vatican that day, sunlight streaming through the arches, he turned back once more, not as an actor, not as a public figure, but as a man who had seen humility turn into healing. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. And this time the Pope waved back. No cameras caught it. No headlines wrote it. But heaven saw it, and that was enough. The story didn't end in the Vatican. It began there, because what the world saw as a moment of rejection turned out to be a revelation about what it means to truly live with humility. Not as an idea, but as a way of being. In the weeks that followed, the video of that silent exchange, the refused handshake, the embrace, the tears, it became something greater than a trending clip. It became a mirror that made people ask themselves, when was the last time I judged before understanding? When was the last time I chose pride over peace? Across continents and languages, people started to reflect differently. Teachers began using it in classrooms to talk about forgiveness. Priests preached about it on Sundays. Even CEOs referenced it in leadership conferences, saying, True authority doesn't dominate. It humbles itself. It was as if that single handshake, refused, then redeemed, had unlocked a forgotten truth buried deep in the modern world. The real lesson, Jonathan once said in an interview months later. People thought the story was about me and the Pope. But it wasn't. It was about all of us. Every person who's ever been misunderstood, disrespected, or underestimated. He leaned forward in his chair, voice soft but steady. See, humility isn't about letting people walk over you. It's about standing tall without needing to shout. He paused for a moment, then smiled. The Pope didn't shake my hand to test me. He did it to teach them. The crowd, the cameras, the world. And in that single sentence, the whole story made sense. Pope Leo XIV's refusal had never been about arrogance. It was a parable, a living lesson acted out before millions, showing how the heart reacts when pride meets patience. That's why he later told his advisors, if I had embraced him immediately, they would have applauded. But by refusing first, they were forced to see who they really were, and who he truly was. Echoes around the world in the months that followed, stories began to surface. Quiet, beautiful ripples of the same message. A politician apologized to an opponent on live TV. A teacher reinstated a student she had unfairly suspended. A viral video showed a man returning to thank the janitor he once ignored. Each act of humility carried the same caption. The handshake lesson, it wasn't a trend. It was a transformation. And when a journalist asked Jonathan what he thought about the movement, he said simply, that's how you know something was from God, when it stops being about you. The Pope's reflection that Christmas during midnight mass. Pope Leo XIV spoke again, his voice calm, his tone different, lighter somehow. In the world today, we chase recognition. We measure worth by applause. But the Son of God came to earth unannounced, in silence, in straw, in humility. And when he stretched out his hand to the world, some refused it. Yet he kept reaching, because love does not retreat when rejected. It remains. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the massive cathedral. So if someone turns away from your kindness, don't close your heart. Keep it open. Keep it extended. Because one day that same hand may lift the world. The crowd rose to their feet in reverent silence. There was no cheering, no shouting, just awe, and in that stillness one could almost hear the whisper of heaven. This is how peace begins. The legacy of the handshake years passed. The frenzy faded, but the meaning remained. Artists painted it, writers wrote about it, and somewhere in a small chapel in Italy, a bronze sculpture was unveiled. Two hands reaching toward each other, not yet touching, but close enough to feel the warmth between them. The plaque beneath it read, "To the moment that taught the world that humility heals." Tourists visited it daily, not for selfies, but for silence. Some prayed, some cried, some just stood there, thinking of their own moments of pride, their own burned bridges, their own unshaken hands. And when they left, many whispered the same quiet promise, next time I'll choose grace. The final message, Jonathan's last public words about the event, came during an interview years later. He smiled, older, gentler, wiser. You know, people still ask me, and did it hurt when he refused your handshake? He laughed softly. At first, yes. My pride hurt, but my soul healed, because what felt like humiliation turned out to be divine preparation. He looked into the camera, eyes filled with peace. If someone closes their hand to you, don't take it personally. Maybe God is using that moment to open yours, he paused. That's what faith really is, not proving you're right, but remaining kind even when you're wronged. Respect isn't shown when everyone's watching. It's revealed when no one is. And humility, true humility, so it isn't about lowering yourself. It's about raising others even when they push you down. So the next time you're tested and the next time someone rejects, mocks, or misunderstands you, remember this story. Remember Jonathan's calm. Remember the Pope's silence. Remember the truth behind that simple, sacred moment. Because sometimes God doesn't send thunder to teach a lesson. Sometimes he sends a handshake. If you believe humility is real strength, type grace in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. I want to thank every heart that still believes kindness can change the world.